Shalom, Baruchim Habayim, welcome to Sheve'im Panim LaTorah, to the 70 Faces of the Torah, and also Sulam Yaakov. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Beha'alotkha, which means when you cause the Menorah, the lights of the Menorah, to ascend. Most translations of Beha'alotkha will say when you kindle the lights, when you light the lights, but as you'll see through the study, Beha'alotkha means when you cause the lights to ascend. In a sense, like in Aliyah, there is an Olah, an ascension that the Torah is talking about in this week's Parsha. I have subtitled this teaching, The Secret of Redemption. Now, right before we begin and delve into this teaching, I just want to take a quick moment here to recognize the current state of conflict that's happening, especially in Israel. As of Erev Shabbat here in the West, going into Shabbat over there, Israel has entered into a conflict with Iran. And most of you have probably seen some of the footages from Western media. However, some of the other footages that I've seen from inside of Israel and parts of the Middle East tell a completely different story of what's happening over there. And this, for example, is a still footage from video of Tel Aviv that took some pretty nasty impacts.
וואי, יש שם, זה לא נפילות?
זה נפילות, אבא, זה נפילות.
The areas that were hit the most, the neighborhood that took a pretty devastating impact, was the neighborhood right outside of Tel Aviv that is actually called Rishon LeZion. This here, the houses, you can see a lot of this is the impact that of direct hits, whether missiles hit the streets or they hit actual property. Tragically, one individual did pass away, a 73-year-old man who passed in this event here. And so this is the morning hours here of what you see in Israel, the recovery as well. Here's another image, also some video showing exactly what it looked like the night of the impact. Also, regarding Israel's attack, they did send another wave of attacks to Iran, which was dealing with, once again, strategic areas, whether it was missile development or other military outpost sites, maybe that they had buried in tunnels.
هاي مسيرة هاي الصاروخ طلعت هاي وقعت هاي وقعت يا الله وقعت طيارة
So nonetheless, I wanted to open things up here since this topic is about the secrets of redemption, and the events that are leading up to what has transpired in Israel has been anticipated for a while now. And the world has kind of got its eyes focused upon this, where the stage is being set. And there's also a anticipation amongst a lot of people with the concept of Mashiach. A lot of people have a Mashiach mind where they anticipate the coming of Mashiach at any moment. While belief in Mashiach and imminent arrival is something that's fundamental in Jewish thought, while it may not be shared by every Jewish person, but it is something rooted in Jewish thought, specifically Rambam's his 13 principles of faith are based upon it. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema b'viat HaMashiach, that I believe in complete faith in the coming, the arrival of the Messiah, which is essentially rooted in the Torah, which is interesting, which comes from out of the words of Bilam HaRasha. Bilam in Parashat Balak, Numbers chapter 24, when he uttered his final nevuah before Balak regarding Israel, which is a part of the extension of the Matovu we say in prayer. He spoke about the star, the comet that comes from out of Yaakov, and he talks about Edom, which is firmly believed to be Western society, and the United States specifically. If you take a look at the words USA and you look at them, how you can spell USA in Hebrew, also spell Esav. So it's fascinating. We have a president who is supposed to represent the good part of Esav, President Trump, and I've talked about this before in the past, but also President Trump has a role to fulfill, whether people like that or not. And the way things are going to unfold is according to the divine wisdom of Hashem. Now, why do I bring this up before we get into the teaching here? Because what I'm talking about is beyond the elucidation of the topic we're going to talk about. I want to mention it because it deals with the concept of Geulah, redemption. That's what a lot of people want to focus upon, is redemption. However, the Torah gives us the blueprint for a redemptive mind. And a lot of times we can have our perception of redemption, and that may not be according to the actual divine wisdom of Hashem. So regarding Bilam, regarding Edom, regarding Mashiach, regarding all of these things, I mentioned right before the turn of the Hebrew year, 5784 to 5785, that when we entered into the month of Chodesh Elul of 5784, there was a phenomenon that took place. And for some of you who've been studying with me for a while, you know that I talked about this. This has also been mentioned by other teachers as well, and rabbis. We had this phenomenon of the Atlas comet. And this comet was very visible for a number of months that you were able to see it, okay, all across the world. And it was interesting, as I mentioned in the Zohar, that in the month of Elul, that when a specific comet would show, it was referencing the prophecy of Bilam, okay, about the actual comet, the star, comes out of Yaakov, which is a messianic sign, and that it would be visible for a certain amount of time. And what's important about that, which I have not gone into detail publicly, but I've done so in my private classes, specifically on Ramchal's Derech Hashem, in which the Ramchal talks about the significant spiritual properties of planets and constellations, the energy that they represent, and that when one visibly appears, what it contains, what it represents, the spiritual energy that parallels to that, and is actually the concretization of it materializing into the lower realm. And so clearly something that is perceived as a messianic sign, it does come as a messianic harbinger per se. And so certain events are going to unfold. And why I mention that before we get into this teaching is that in light of everything that's happening in the world, the events that happen with Russia, Ukraine, the things right now with Israel, Iran, the things that are happening with the economy, things that are happening with the United States, also with all the riots that have been happening, which are funded by somebody or someone, for that matter, protesting Trump's decision, the re-inauguration of President Trump. All these things are significant. They play a very vital role because there are a focus on the end of days regarding Israel, regarding ancient Persia, which is modern-day Iran, and specifically Edom. And at this point, Edom, yes, it represents the West, but the leader of Edom would be considered the United States. And someone such as President Trump clearly fulfills the role of the leader of Edom. And while there's split opinions on what role that fulfills, nonetheless, collectively, most people agree that definitely he is playing the role of leader of Edom in the final stages of end-of-day scenario. And why that's important is as you study things closely, we have to see how things play out. I mean, most people, for example, the modern state of Israel is considered a rogue state, and some people do not consider a rogue state. There are those who are anti-Zionists, there are those who are pro-Zionists. But nonetheless, the current government of Israel is not a Torah-abiding government, right? And I'm not trying to be super religious here upon, let's say, if someone who's not observant in Israel, they identify as what's called a Chiloni. But the point is, the Torah is the constitution of the people of Israel, okay? Not democracy, all right? And so what we have in Israel, is really, most people believe that Israel controls the United States. It's the other way around. Israel is a proxy for the United States. Just like Hezbollah or Hamas is a proxy for Iran. And Iran, what most people don't realize, the current version of Iran that we have was established by the United States, okay? Our intelligence agency went in there, propped up this government that's there, just like many other places. So what we're experiencing and what we're witnessing is we're seeing a collapse of certain regimes. We're seeing the hand of Hashem at work, and how this is going to play out, we don't know. So we can see certain things happen, the collapse of Iran, the collapse of the United States, the collapse of Israel, and what's going to emerge out of it, nobody knows. And this is why I want to talk about this teaching from this week's Parashat, because this week's Torah portion, it teaches us something significant when it comes to redemption, the state of mind that we should have. It's not about a fanfare or a political fanfare, a military fanfare. Because as I was looking in real time, the events taking place, the news that comes from parts of Iran and the Arab world, you see rejoicing when in Yemen, they had put a massive screen up, and I don't know if I have the video, if so, I'll show it on here, a massive screen of people who are supportive of the Houthis. They had it like a massive screen, like in a stadium, showing live time, the missile impact in Tel Aviv, and people were cheering. It's like, people were rejoicing. And then when they found out one individual, the elderly man who in Rishon LeZion was killed from the missile impact, they're rejoicing. It's a sad state where, we rejoice over someone dying or damage per se. It's a very sad state that, humans have to resort to such a thing. It's not to say that you can't celebrate when there's victory, when defeating an enemy, okay, but to sit there and just rejoice, in such a inhumane manner, without a concern for nothing, because then what do you do when the tables turn and then there's millions of dollars of damage in your country, or there's massive bloodshed in your country? In this situation, it comes with that territory. It's not right for righteous people to rejoice over somebody, especially innocents, being killed per se. So I share all that because when the Torah talks about redemption, it doesn't speak about redemption according to our perspective. That's very important. And the Torah, just as the Ramchal shares in his Maimar HaGeulah, the secrets of redemption that he talked about, the Torah's narrative of redemption is different from ours. So for example, we read in Parashat Beha'alotkha that the Torah returns to the narrative of Israel's redemption from Mitzrayim. And this is very, very important. Why return to the narrative of Yetziat Mitzrayim? Why go back to that point? The redemption process for Mitzrayim was about transforming Am Israel into their spiritual calling. However, the narrative of redemption was interrupted back in Parashat Kitasa with the whole transgression of the Egel Zahav, or what we call the golden calf. And so when Beha'alotkha returns to the redemption narrative, it focuses on the mitzvah of Pesach. We go here in Numbers chapter 9, verse 1 through 3. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe v'midbar Sinai b'shana hasheni letzetam me'eretz Mitzrayim b'chodesh harishon lemor. Hashem spoke to Moshe in the wilderness of Sinai in the second year from their exodus from the land of Mitzrayim in the first month, which is Nisan, saying to them, Vaya'asu v'ni Yisrael et ha'pasach b'modo. The children of Israel shall make the Pesach in its appointed time. Be'arba'a aser yom b'chodesh, on the 14th day hazeh of this month, and it shall be ben ha'arba'im, in the afternoon. Ta'asu, you shall make it oto b'moado, in its appointed time, kechol chukotav, according to all its decrees, uchol mishpatav, and all of its laws. Ta'asu oto is how you shall make it. The reason why the Torah returns to the narrative of redemption with the mitzvah of Pesach is because Pesach is supposed to renew the consciousness of Israel's mission, their mandate of what their purpose is. This is important because we just got done celebrating Shavuot, which was 50 days, a spiritual journey from Pesach. And here we are in this physical time and dimension, at this point of time, with the events that are unfolding in Eretz HaKodesh. Israel's mission was defined when they stood before Har Sinai, where they experienced the Shekhinah. And at the same time, they committed the transgression of the Egel Zahav there. And so the Torah wants every soul in Israel to be conscious of their calling. The Korban Pesach was to reinstill in the people the foundation of emunah. The mitzvah of offering the Pesach was actually what we call a mesirut hanefesh, an act of self-sacrifice that transcends logic. Since the ram was worshipped by the Mitzrim, Israel demonstrated an act of faith that could have gotten them killed, because the ram, the physical representation of it, the animal, was a physical representation, a metaphor of the gashmiyut, the physicality, the materialism that Egypt worshipped. And Israel was also guilty of being caught within that klipa. And therefore, as an act of mesirut hanefesh, they had to actually learn to let go of it, to be willing to slaughter it, meaning that they could have been killed by the Mitzrim for basically going to sacrifice what the Mitzrim worshipped. And it's very similar to what would have to take place in the end of days when we talk about Edom, specifically the Klipa of Edom. The Klipa of Edom represents a shell that limits, it traps an individual from their potential. And being called Edom, representing Western society, representing Esav and what he fell to when he did not fulfill his potential, it represents a state of mind, a state of existence that Israel will find itself in at the end of days. So concepts like democracy or imitating the Western nations, this is a part of the Klipa of Edom, okay? And so Israel also wants to have success over its outside enemies, has to overcome its internal enemy first. That's also going to require an act of emunah and bitachon. And so, according to the Torah, if Israel was going to continue the path of redemption, they needed to reconnect themselves to the primary element that would help them experience redemption, which is none other than faith, emunah. And while reconnecting the people to the original path of redemption seems hopeful, the truth is we discover an episode in this week's Torah portion that shatters hope for redemption. Later on, in chapter 10, we encounter what appears to be an anomaly within the text. We encounter what appears to be two inverted nunes, the letter nun. They are actually inverted. So they're reversed and they're flipped upside down as well. This is how they are recorded in the Sefer Torah according to Masoretic tradition. The letters are inverted not by accident. They were designed that way. They're inverted because what follows is a story that inverted the redemption process. Parashat Beha'alotkha is a dramatic climax of messianic potential, but due to the people's failure to grasp their potential, their history then became inverted. The two inverted nunes marked what should have been the great redemptive journey into Eretz HaKodesh. Had Moshe entered Eretz Israel, the Messianic era would have commenced. However, because Moshe did not enter Eretz HaKodesh, Israel's history took a precipitous turn, and upon the pages of Jewish history, Moshe left us a lesson with the two inverted nunes to teach us that if we want to truly experience redemption, we need to learn from mistakes made in the past. Now, according to Chazal, in their infinite wisdom that God gave them, the two inverted nunes in verse 35 to 36 of chapter 10 was actually supposed to be an entirely different chumash or book in the Torah. Besides the 5 books that we have, they should have been a separate book. And in Masechet Shabbat, Chazal explained that the original chumash of Moshe should actually have been 7 in total. So it would have been Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, then what we call Bamidbar, okay, for the wilderness, Numbers 1, 10 through 34 would have been its own chumash. Then Numbers 10, 35 through 36 would have been another chumash. And then Numbers 11, 1 through 36, 13 would have been another chumash. And then you would have had Devarim, totaling 7 here. However, the people were not ready for redemption. And therefore, the chumash that we have is now 5 instead of 7. So, okay, what secret is contained by the 2 inverted nunes? So let's take a look here at Numbers chapter 10, verse 35 to 36. And I left there highlighted in yellow the 2 nunes just as they appear in the Sefer Torah. Okay, there it says, Vayihi ben Soharon vayome Moshe. When the ark would journey, Moshe said, Kuma Adonai ve'afusu oyevecha ve'yanusu misanecha mipanecha. Arise, Hashem, let your enemies be scattered, let those who hate you flee from before you. And then it goes on to say, and when it rested, Uvnu chol yomar shuva Adonai rivot alfei Israel. Reside tranquilly, O Hashem, among the myriad thousands of Israel. Now I can tell you with the events that have unfolded just within the past few hours with Israel and Iran, that this has been a theme for a lot of rabbis to try to look at, okay, to garnish support and strength for the Jewish state. That here, arise Hashem, your enemies are those of the enemies of the Jewish state. This is going to be controversial, but this is not what this verse means. And this is taking this verse out of context. This verse has nothing to do with Gentiles, as you're going to see here, and that's the shocking thing. And if you truly want to learn about redemption, then you learn it properly according to the Torah, not to the opinion of a teacher or a rabbi that has a biased opinion. So the question here is, how is this phrase, Vayihi ben Soha'aron, a secret to redemption? And this is also the very verse that's uttered when we bring the Sefer Torah from out the ark. Furthermore, in what manner did the people fail to eternalize this verse? I want to also point out, once again, when the Torah returns to the narrative of redemption with the mitzvah of Pesach, it's because the mitzvah of Pesach renews the consciousness of the people regarding their mission. However, because the people failed to identify themselves with the will of Hashem, there was a dichotomy between them and Moshe Rabbeinu. The expression, Vayihi ben Soha'aron, refers to the journeys of the Torah, which according to Moshe was God's expeditions of the earth. When the Torah finds its own home, there's no dwelling for the Shekhinah, which is the indwelling in God's presence. Vayihi ben Soha'aron invokes Hashem's Torah. Vayefutzu oyevecha ve'yanusu misanecha mipanecha. Scatter his enemies and push away his haters. Many of us are familiar in the Shemoni Esrei with the Birchat Minim, the blessing against heretics, which is inspired by the verse that we just read there in Numbers 10:35, verse 36. We say, "Velamanim ba'tihei tikva." There's no hope for heretics. V'chulam kerega yovedu. They will be gone within an instant, a moment. V'chol oyevecha mehira yikartehu. May all enemies be immediately cut off. V'tachnia otam b'mehira v'yamenu. And overpowered speedily in our days. Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you Hashem, shoveh oyevim, who is the crusher, the breaker of enemies, umachniya zedim, and subduer of the insolent. If Moshe is invoking the Torah to scatter and push away the enemies and haters of Hashem, this means that the reason why there are enemies and haters is because they are insubordinate to the Torah. This means that the enemies and haters are none other than the Jewish people who have failed to eternalize the path of redemption. This has nothing to do with non-Jews, because non-Jews are not obligated to any mitzvot in the Torah. The Torah's demand, for self-control and moral sanctification stands in sharp opposition to the allurement of vulgar sensuality. The Torah was not only hated by sinful Jews, but it was persecuted by them. In fact, the word misanecha, if I could bring it up on the screen here. Okay, misanecha is used in the PL form, or what's considered the intensive form, saneh, which indicates hateful propaganda that arouses hatred of an object. The Torah was standing in the way of the people's Yetzer Hara. The only path of redemption was the Torah, and when the Torah became the object of the people's hatred, because it dictated how they should govern their lives, the hope of redemption was shattered in the wilderness. The same stands true today. That's very important. When the Torah is in opposition to the people's philosophy, ideology, hashkafa, whatever you want to call it, it's something that the people despise and the people hate. The early pioneers in the Zionistic movement were not firm believers in Hashem. And by the way, this has nothing to do about being anti-Zionist or anything, none of that. The point is, what I'm trying to show here is that if you want redemption, you go by the way of the Torah, not philosophy or some type of geopolitical ideology. You go by the path of the Torah. And so individuals of the early Zionistic movement, as well as many Israeli politicians today, concepts like Mashiach, Moshe Rabbeinu, Torah, these are fairy tales to them. They don't actually believe they're legitimately true. Now, does that mean that should disregard the entire, what's called, state of Israel or the people that live in it? No, it should not. Ultimately, one will be a segue for the other, meaning that Hashem will use one. If one source is like an Arav source, he will use that, even if it's proxy of another country like Edom, to finalize, to pave the way for the true Israel to emerge. But for that to happen, you have to follow the blueprint to true redemption. So nevertheless, Moshe's invocation of Vayehi ben Haaron was a prophetic word that the Torah would prevail, not democracy. The Torah would prevail. This is the reason why we invoke, once again, this verse for Numbers 10:35 every time we take the Torah from out of the ark. We're not just having a religious sing-along. No. When done with kavanah, true intention, that when invoking the words Vayehi ben Haaron, we are making a declaration that the Torah will prevail in our lives. When the ark of the Torah set out, Moshe was confident that the Torah would complete its course on the earth. And as the Torah goes forth in the lives of man, it does what? Vayafusu oyevecha vayanusu misanecha mipanecha. It scatters, it pushes away the Yetzer Hara, which is an enemy and hater of the Torah. Going back to the remaining segment of the verse here and verse 36. It's very interesting. I want to point out that when Moshe wrote that when the ark would rest, he did not write here when he says uv nuchol, right? He did not write nuchol, but rather he wrote nuchol. Now what's the difference? They sound exactly the same. But there is a slight difference if you listen to the Gadol Chet and how it's pronounced. Because the first word at the top, nuchol, is masculine, so there's a little bit emphasized there in the Gadol Chet, where nucho is feminine, so there's a little bit more softer, guttural there. It's interesting. He didn't use the masculine, right? He used the feminine form. What's this mean? Moshe envisioned that the day will come when the Torah will not stand in opposition, right? Which is nucho, which is masculine struggle within mankind. Rather, with all its power, the Torah would be morashat, it would be betrothed, it would be acquired to mankind, like a woman. Once this happened, what did Moshe then go on to say? Go back here to Numbers 10, verse 36. At the end, he says, Rivot alfei Israel. Interesting. The phrase here, Rivot alfei Israel, which we roughly translate to myriad thousands of Israel, alludes to the myriads that will arise and develop from thousands of Israel's obedience to the Torah. In other words, friends, when Am Israel attaches themselves truly to the Torah, They will become pregnant from the Torah, and they will give birth to spiritual offspring. Well, what's their spiritual offspring supposed to look like? Zechariah tells us, Zechariah 2:15, when it says, "V'ni'uvu goyim rabim Adonai bayom hahu v'hayu li le'am v'shachati v'tochech." Many nations will join themselves to Hashem on that day, and they will become a people unto me, and I will dwell in you, in your midst, but in you. Toch is the root there, v'tochech, feminine form, betochach, okay, in you. Like ve'yasu lemetash v'shachati betochem, as it says in Exodus 25:8, to dwell, create a dwelling place for the divine presence of Hashem. This is the end goal. But what do you see right now? A part of the unfolding stages, a nevuah prophecy, whatever we want to call it, we see a massive dichotomy forming within the world. In North America, you see a lot of rampant anti-Semitism, and then we saw President Trump basically legislate protection against anti-Semitism, especially universities. Well, I do believe in people's right to peacefully protest, it's peacefully, okay, not cause riots. I do respect the First Amendment. What I don't respect is when people then go try to oppress and commit violence upon people, if they're Jewish or for any other nationality or belief for that matter. So we see that basically he stops federal funding to universities. They're not holding students in check or professors in check. So that's a positive thing. But at the same time, we also see the world is ran on Jewish conspiracies, right? Israel needs to be obliterated. Even within the United States, there are those who question, why do we support Israel, right? And I understand, you should support your own country when you're in it. But there are people who are not too fond of Israel. These are extremists, okay? Whether they're of a liberal or conservative branch, they have no respect for Israel. And so as things are ramping up, you'll see parts of the world are not very fans, they're not fans of Israel. So you don't see this prophecy. You do see people waking up and they are joining Israel. You do see that there are supporters, so don't get me wrong. But this nevuah here, according to the Tanakh, is something that's going to come. It's reciprocating. It's responding to Israel. And as the Ramchal talks about Mamar HaGeulah, that when Israel does strengthen itself in Kedusha, the Klippa breaks apart, then you start to gather the holy sparks from all the nations. They will come. Doesn't mean all of them, but there will be enough. So which means when the spiritual work is being done, Hashem will oversee everything, engineer everything that needs to take place. But if we do things within our own ability, thinking we're going to put our trust in flesh and blood or military programs, then we're setting ourselves up for failure. And so the Torah is telling us that since Israel was not ready for messianic redemption, it goes on to tell us about the wrath of Hashem that afflicted the people in what was called Kivrot HaTava, which literally means the grave of lust. Why is it called the grave of lust? Because in Kivrot HaTava, we read how the sins of the people propagated hate of Hashem's Torah by desiring to return to Mitzrayim. And so we go here to Numbers chapter 11, verse 4 through 6, and the Torah reads over there something very interesting. V'ha'as fesuf asher bekirbo tit avu ta'ava. Now, the translations, don't mind it because we're going to look, it doesn't really reflect an accurate translation of what the Hebrew says. There's not a good equivalent, and I explained this millions of times. But most translations will say the rabble. If you want a literal definition, the collection. What's that even mean? We'll see in a minute. The collection. V'ha'as fasuf was among them, but literally bikirbo, in them. That's important. And therefore cultivated hit avu tava, a taiva, a desire, a craving. Vayashuvu vayivchu gam b'nei Israel vayomeru mi ya'achilenu basar. And the children of Israel began to cry, and they said, who's going to feed us basar? Who's going to feed us meat? Zacharnu, we remember et hadaga, the fish, Asher nochal, that we ate, where? B'Mitzrayim, back in Mitzrayim at our favorite restaurants. Chinam, it was free of charge because we were depending on the government with all their subsidized programs, Section 8 welfare, Obamacare, whatever the heck was going on. That's what we did. Also, the cucumbers, melons, leek, onions, garlic. However, v'ata, now, nashenu, yivesha, our soul, the lower life force of the soul, the nefesh, oh, it's parched. Enko, there's nothing. Bliti, we have nothing. El hama enenu, to anticipate, but the manna. Now, many commentaries, they will say, oh, the reference here to what they call the rabble, the collection, ha'asfasuf, is related to what's called the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude of non-Jews who came out of Mitzrayim with Israel and were the ones responsible for the golden calf. And therefore, these were the ones responsible for God's wrath here at this location in Kivrot HaTava. I would like to suggest something else. In juxtaposition to Israel's inability to experience redemption with the verses of inverted nunes, okay, that Israel's inability to experience redemption is not because they had a group of non-Jews in their midst, right? To me, that's a lame excuse of a victim mentality, of pointing the finger to somebody else. Oh, it's the fake Gerim's fault that we couldn't experience. So you're going to blame the alleged ger, right? A possible convert, would-be convert. They're to blame for our inability to succeed. I don't buy that. That's a victim's mentality. And I hate to say it, the Jewish people have been playing the victim card for too long. It's time to stop that stuff. Has nothing to do with that. Okay, we see here that when the Torah comes along and mentions Beha'asfesuf, the collection, this is not referring to an entity of a group of people, but rather the Torah is saying this is referring to the non-Jewish nature that dwells inside of the Jews. How can I say that? Well, for one, the doubling of the root letters in the actual word, ha'asfasuf, indicates that eternally the souls of Israel absorb something fatal to their soul. The letter Aleph that you read here in ha'asfasuf adds the nuance of the meaning that the absorption of evil was influence from the outside, meaning the enticements of what they miss in Mitzrayim, the nostalgia where they were tolerant of a certain lifestyle and their behavior that they wanted to go back to because they were not trying to change their character in the wilderness. This is why they wanted to go back to the former conditions that they were used to. They had it made even if they were struggling in poverty there. And so the three-letter root, asaf, literally means to gather, is a permutation of the word safaf. Permutation meaning you change the letters there. And so safaf means threshold. And the word safaf is from the root word saf, which means container. Okay? The threshold of a container would be its point of entrance. Spiritually speaking, the Yetzer Hara was successful in entering into the mind of the Israelites and stirred within them this lustful desire of their ego, this desire to return because they were set in their ways. They didn't want to change their ways. The lustful desires of their ego is what caused them to want to return to Mitzrayim, to a life of spiritual restriction. Because Mitzrayim is not limited to a location in the Middle East. Mitzar, as I explained before, that three-letter root means restriction. They wanted to stay at a lower level of consciousness. And as I explained before, Beha'alotkha returns to the narrative of redemption by having Israel commit themselves to the mitzvah of Pesach. By failing to eternalize the mitzvah of Pesach, by sacrificing the image that Mitzrayim worshipped, that represents physicality, gashmiyut, the people were not ready for a spiritual transformation. The people confessed that if they lived according to the Torah, that the Torah deprives the animal soul, the nefesh behamit, the sustenance of their lustful drives. We'll go right here, back to Numbers 11:6. Ve'ata, and now, nafshenu, nefesh, the lowest level, nefesh, ruach, neshama, chai, yechida. The nefesh is the lowest aspect of the soul. It's what the ego turns on when it's more ego conscious, body conscious. Ve'ata nafshenu yivesha enko bliti el hama enenu. The nefesh is drained out. There's nothing enticing it. We only have this man. That's food for the soul, the neshama. And the word yavesh here, from yivesha, means to wither away. The people were they didn't want to change their lifestyle. They were used to doing certain things, speaking a certain way, thinking a certain way. They were limited to that restriction of Mitzrayim. They didn't want to change. Why did the people respond negatively to the man? In verse 8, the Torah says that the people actually had to roam to go find the manna. Very interesting. We read Numbers 11:8. Shatu ha'am velaktu. The people roamed about and gathered it. Rabbi Shimshon Chershen's commentary, he said, the man did not come to them without effort on their part. Rather, as a result of activity, and the term shut indicated that this activity was not monotonous. They roamed in various directions in order to obtain the man, and this provided mental stimulation. Now, what Rav Hirsch is saying here is built off of a Maimer Chazal. In fact, in Masechet Yoma, Chazal explained that if you were righteous, okay, meaning you had emunah and betachon in Hashem, that the man would actually appear right at the front of your tent every morning. You just had to open your tent door and it'd be right there. But if you were a Benoni, a Rasha, a Benoni is like someone in between, like you're lukewarm. A Rasha is someone who's not fully committed to belief in Hashem, right? You lacked emunah. Then you had to go out and walk a few miles until you gathered any man. We read here in Masechet Yoma 75a, Chazal says, Ketiv urede chata el hamachane laila, and it says, and when the dew fell upon the camp at night, the man fell upon it. Okay? Numbers 11:9. Also, Uchtiv, Vayatza ha'am v'lakitu, and it's written that the people shall go out and gather every day's portion. Exodus 16:4. Also, Uchtiv, it's written over there, Shatu ha'am v'lakitu, that the people went about, they roamed, and they gathered it. Numbers 11:8. So here Chazal said, HaKetzad, how can these texts be reconciled, right? One says that in Numbers 11:9, that the man fell right upon it. Others say they went out to gather it. How do you reconcile this? Either it fell upon it or it didn't. Oh, Sadiqim yara el petach batehem. If you were righteous, then the man fell right at the opening of your home. All right? They therefore expended no effort whatsoever. They didn't have to go out. Benonim, if you were a Benoni, an average person, lukewarm in your commitment to Hashem, Yatseyu v'lakitu, they had to go outside the camp to gather it, right? So they had to go out. However, Rashaim, if you were a complete unbeliever, Shatu v'lakitu, then you had to stroll further out to go gather it. Now, what's interesting about this is that you can actually read the word over here, Shatu, used from the verse, strolling. You can actually read it as Shatuta. Okay? Stupidity. Shtuyot. Shatuta. Stupidity. So what the Torah is saying, and what Rav Hirsch was saying, the ones who did not have emunah betachon in Hashem, they were forced to stroll around and gather the man like a bunch of idiots. Stunados, they say in Italian. And by being forced to stroll for the man, it would then challenge the people mentally. It would make them think, make them want to have a conversation, a little hipodadut with Hashem, to talk to Hashem. Make them think. The reason why they had to travel so far for their portion of man is because they did not have any faith in Hashem. That's the reason. Because how is it that, your neighbor down the street, your in-law down the street, the man shows right up, like, the Malach, Raphael brings it right to the doorstep, right, of the tent. And yet here you are, you got to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to travel out in the wilderness to go find a mountain. Like, what's going on here, right? And it's because essentially those people had no faith. That's why on a personal level, when you look at the application of this, when you're going through hardships and difficulties and things are not going right and things are going good in other people's lives, not that you should be, envious of them, but it's to make you think and communicate with Hashem. What am I doing wrong? What am I not doing right? Why is this happening? Why is this not succeeding? Why am I failing? And therefore Hashem guides you and directs you. So the consequences of this whole episode result in what became known as Kivrot HaTa'avah, the grave of lust. Grave of lust, due to the strong desires to return back to a former lifestyle Mitzrayim. The people were dying in the wilderness because of their ego. Kivrot HaTa'avah, the grave of lustful desire, is not just the grave that man digs for himself, but is the grave which the desire digs for man. Now, if the expression Vayihi B'Tzo Ha'aron is the secret of redemption, how are we to avoid the pitfalls that Israel fell victim to? When Israel was beginning their journey to Eretz HaKodesh, the Torah focuses on the concept of traveling with the Mishkan. We see here in Numbers 9, 17 through 18, it says over there, Ufi Beha'alotkha enan be'ahaohe v'acharechen yis'u b'nei Yisrael. And whenever the cloud, which is the Shekhinah, was lifted above the tent, the children of Israel would follow. Uv mikom asher. And in the place, Yishchan Sham, that the cloud would rest, Ha'enan Sham yachanu b'nei Israel, there the children of Israel would encamp. Al pi Adonai yisu b'nei Israel, according to the word of Hashem, would the children of Israel journey. Va'al pi Adonai yachanu, and according to the word of Hashem, they would encamp. So we find the expression Al pi Adonai being repeated throughout this section of the Torah. Why? The Torah uses the word nasa, which means to pull up. It's used as a figure of speech that means to get up and to travel. Nasa is also related to the word nasach, which means to pull down. Now, if you're not fluent in Hebrew or Hebrew grammar, you might say, nasa and nasach, they sound different. One has a chet in it and the other doesn't. Well, because ayin and chet are gutturals, just like the letter hey and naseh after are guttural. They're pronounced from the throat. Okay? So the ayin is a deeper ayin versus an aleph. Okay? So nasa is related to nasach. Okay? So you have nasa, which we see here, nasach means to pull down. And both nasach and nasa are related to the word naseh, which refers to testing and training. And this teaches us that the path of redemption is paved by constant traveling that is designed to test us. And unless we undergo spiritual training, we will never be qualified for, guess what? Eretz HaKodesh, for the Holy Land of Israel. Even if there's a current secular state that abides in that land today, you're going to constantly have conflict after conflict after conflict after conflict, because you're not following the blueprint to true Geulah, which is the Sefer Torah. We learn that the name of this Torah portion is connected with the Menorah. That's what the beginning of the Torah portion deals with, which is also connected with the Shekhinah. We go back here to the beginning of Numbers chapter 8, verse 2, and it says, the Ber el Aharon, Hashem told Moshe, speak to your brother Aaron, V'amata elav, and say to him, Beha'alotkha et hanerot el mu penei ha-menorah ya'iru shivat hanerot. When you elevate the lamps, and once again, most translations say when you kindle, when you light, but when you elevate the lamps, toward the face of menorah shall the 7 lamps cast light. The word here, Beha'alotkha, does not mean kindle, does not mean light. It comes from the root Allah, which means to ascend, to elevate. And so in truth, the focus of the word Beha'alotkha is really not traced so much at the beginning of the parsha, with the menorah, but it's actually traced to the very middle of the Torah portion, which deals with the ascension of the Shekhinah over the Mishkan, leading Israel in the wilderness. So we go to chapter 9, verse 17, where we just read earlier, Ufi Beha'alotkha, and whenever the cloud, meaning the Shekhinah, would ascend, okay, Ma'al ha'ohed, above the tent, V'acharei ken yisu b'nei Israel, the children of Israel will follow after. So what we're learning here is that the Torah is teaching us that the catalyst to our ascent is the word of Hashem, which is the Torah. Now, once again, Parashat Beha'alotkha begins by mentioning the menorah. And I've explained many times in the past, especially with my commentaries on Parashat Truma, Tetzaveh, that the inner meaning of the menorah is really about it being a microcosm for man. And according to Chazal, the menorah was positioned in the south part of the shulchan, of the tabernacle, all right, or in the temple, in the what we call the actual inside the sanctuary, all right. And based upon this layout, it would reveal that the lateral branches of the menorah would face east, okay. East would be towards the opening of the sanctuary where the people could see from the outside in the courtyard. And the west part would face towards the actual, the Holy of Holies, all right? And so we see here, this is the south, okay? Facing directly in front of that is the Lechem Panim, okay, which would be the north. And here's a wider view, okay? What that is. Now, why is this significant? The positioning is everything. The west side symbolizes the direction of Torah, okay? That's why the Ner Tamid, the eternal light, was also called the western lamp by the rabbis. It was closer to the Kodesh HaKodeshim. The north side symbolizes materialism, which represents the Lechem Panim, the bread representing material. The south symbolizes wisdom, which is what the menorah represents. The east, where the people stood outside, it symbolizes like volition. It's an invitation for the people to come inside, closer to the Torah of Hashem. And so I explained many times that depending on the specific korban a person would take when they would go through this experience, it was an experience like no other that you can't put into words. When going through that experience, bringing the proper korban and witnessing the Kohen receive the blood and then apply it to the altar in silence. And then you would look inside the chechel, the sanctuary, and you would see the light. The left three lateral branches pertain towards the Torah. It represents sight, not visible sight, but how you perceive Hashem is through His word. And if a person had a blind vision spiritually, they misrepresented the word of Hashem. Their volition was then misappropriated, meaning their finances were misappropriated, means their gashmiyut, their physicality, were misappropriated, and they lack chokhmah, wisdom. So when they would rectify this, the whole light aspect, the wisdom that they would obtain, would teach them how to properly use the physical world, okay, the financial world, all those gifts and talents that they had, because now they have a proper perception of the Torah. And so this entire sanctification process all took place outside where the korbanot was done, because the korbanot was symbolic of the people learning to die to their animalistic desire. That's why the certain animal personalities the Torah permitted to be used for the korbanot are the ones that are closely resemble the personality traits of man. And so essentially what we learn from this entire format with the menorah's position in the sanctuary, opposite of the Shocha Lechem Panim, is that the spirit granted by God and fostered in His sanctuary is the same spirit that seeks God's nearness in His Torah and His covenant that He established with Israel for the sake of His Torah. And so this spirit creates within us the awareness that places the entire material realm under the impress of its spiritual destiny, and it creates the moral volition of performance that implement the spiritual within the material realm. This explains, once again, why the menorah is positioned south of the Lechem Panim, the bread, the material realm. The material realm can have no meaning unless the light of spirituality is cast upon it. This is why, like, we live in a technologically advanced society. I mean, And it's unique and it's amazing what we could come up with, but unless there's some type of spiritual meaning, substance behind it, it means nothing. It's treated robotically. It means nothing. And that's why companies can gaslight the public on certain cell phones. Like I got the certain cell phone 20 came out, and it's the same thing as a 16. Oh, but we just added it's 25-inch screen now, right? You have to have some type of light of spirituality upon it. And likewise, it's also the reverse. Spirituality has absolutely no meaning unless it can utilize the material realm to reveal the will of God. This is why if a person is so spiritual, they're trapped inside of their place of worship all the time. Like, oh, this person's that's a Sadiq more, a very righteous saint, very holy. They live in the mountains, right? Who cares? No disrespect to a person. Maybe they need to go through a period of isolation to spiritually detox from things of the world, but Hashem didn't create us as angels, okay? So-and-so took a vow of celibacy since they were age 2. Oh, wow, great, nice, okay, good for them. It means nothing, okay? Spirituality has no meaning unless it can utilize the material realm. You have to learn to balance the two. So I want you once again keep in mind that the menorah has 2 branches, a right and left lateral side. The east side, the right side represents the people's volition. The left side represents the Torah, represents perception. And depending on how one perceives God's Torah will determine their volition when it comes to the material realm. They're either going to use their spiritual gifts and talents for the right thing, or they can use it for the wrong thing. The Torah seeks its realization in Israel, and Israel seeks the molding of its character in the Torah. Now, the Torah describes the menorah being hammered out of one piece of gold, one solid unit. We see here in Numbers 8:4. V'zei ma'aseh ha-menorah miksha zahav ad yeracha apricha miksha. This is the production of the menorah, hammered out of gold from its base to its flowering. It is hammered out, and then we see it says, Chamarei asher ha'adonai et Moshe. According to the vision that Hashem showed Moshe. We'll come back to this in a minute here. This is very interesting. Now, we see the menorah is described essentially as a tree of gold. A tree of gold. From the root of the tree, ad yiracha, all the way to its flowering, its budding, ad pricha. It's one unit. The Torah describes that the menorah is a microcosm of man. That if rooted in the Torah, will blossom with light. So what we learn from this is that in individuals as well as nations, development to the highest spiritual blossoming requires time, much like the maturing of a tree requires time. Likewise, eternalizing Torah requires time. For the individual, it could take years. For a nation, it could take centuries. Like a tree, the menorah is formed of one mass, which already includes the material for everything. So when the Torah comes along, I'll bring this back on the screen, and it says, Chamar e asher Adonai et Moshe. According, like, because you have a prefix kaf there, like the vision that Hashem showed Moshe. What Hashem showed Moshe is that the menorah, as well as the other kelim, vessels of the Mishkan, they're a microcosm of man's potential. So you go back to where this originally appears, and it's in Parashat Trumah, Exodus 25, verse 9, and Hashem told Moshe after about Ve'asul mikdash v'shachanti betocham, and they should produce from me a dwelling that I may dwell in them, which is verse 8. Verse 9, it goes on to say, like everything that I showed you, et tavnit, the form, the blueprint, hamishkan, of the Mishkan, definite article, because he was showing him what it looked like in the world above, ve'tavnit, and also the blueprint called kelav, of all the vessels, v'chein ta'asu, so shall you do, so shall you produce. Now, I explained before, and I'll bring it up here again. Anyone with a basic understanding of Hebrew grammar will know that if you were having a conversation with a person and you desire to show a person something, similar to Hashem wanting to show Moshe how to produce the Mishkan and the respective Kelim, the Menorah, etc., that you are showing them something and pointing it to them in the form of grammar, you would actually say what appears at the top. You would say, Ani ma'elecha et tavnita mishkan. Let me show to you the actual blueprint of the Mishkan. That's how you would say it. Ani ma'ale, right? You would not say, as it appears in the Torah here in verse 9, you would not say, Ani ma'aleotecha et tavnita mishkan. That's not how you would say it. So why does the Torah have bad grammar? Why? Because when Hashem tells Moshe, Ani ma'aleotecha, he's telling Moshe, let me show you. In other words, let me show you your real potential in creating me a dwelling place. The Mishkan, once again, is a microcosm of man. The Menorah and all the other respective Kelim are microcosms of man. The reason why Israel was not worthy of redemption was because they did not eternalize the Torah. Simple and plain. They continued to exist as a Jewish nation without a homeland, a Jewish state without a kingdom. They had their issues, they had their conflicts, all because they did not eternalize the Torah. And like a tree that has yet to produce fruit, Israel was spiritually underdeveloped. If Israel was spiritually underdeveloped, was it their fault that they were not ready for redemption? What do I mean? Let's say if a person plants an orange tree as a seed, and they had to wait 10 years until it started producing fruit. Should that person be mad at the tree because it has not undergo the full maturing process before it can yield fruit? It'd be stupid of the person to curse the tree, right? If our ability to produce fruit depends on our cultivation of Torah, what can we do to ensure that our growth process is not hindered, not tampered with? What can we do to make sure the Torah prevails in our lives? So I'd like to delineate here to the words of Chazal, Masechet Ta'anit 24a. It's an interesting statement they bring down. It says, Yom Echad, that one day, and this is attributed to Rav Yosef of Yuchras, it says that he hired workers to work for him in the field. The evening came upon him, but he did not bring bread for the workers to eat. And therefore they said to their son, we are hungry. And they were sitting at that time under a fig tree that was not yet in season. And so Amar, Te'ena, Hotzii perotaich. He said, fig tree, bring forth your fruit, so that the workers of my father may eat. And it says, it brought forth its fruit, and the workers ate. Now, in Jewish thought, a fig tree represents the fruit of Torah. We read here in Masechet Orvin 54a, they sit over there in the name Amar Rabbi Chia, Rav Chiva Bar Abba. He says in the name of Rav Yochanan, what is the meaning of that which is written? He who guards the fig tree shall eat of its fruit, quoting from Proverbs 27 verse 18. And so the question is asked afterwards, Mata and Ezo, why is the Torah compared to a fig? As in the case with this fig tree, that every time a person handles it, he finds ripe figs on it. The same is true with Divrei Torah, with words of Torah. Every time a person studies them, he finds flavor in them. Unlike the fruit of other trees which ripen simultaneously, the fruit of a fig tree ripens at staggered intervals. And so at any point in the season, one could find a fig tree, newly ripened figs ready to be consumed. Now, in relation to Chazal's comment of the fig tree with Proverbs 27 verse 18, every time we study Torah, we can always find a new idea. This is the concept behind the Midrash's Shevim Panim LeTorah, that there are 70 faces of the Torah. We just need to know where to look at. Now, some find new ideas by reading the text more closely. Others study Mefarshim, commentaries. Okay, others study with a teacher, with a chavorah, with a study partner, right? And they get chirushim, new insights, whatever the case may be. So why is the Torah compared to a fig? Because most fruits, if you will, they contain something that is inedible. And so dates, for example, they have a pit, grapes have hard seeds, pomegranates, they have a peel, but every part of a fig is good to eat. Likewise with the Torah, every part of it contains wisdom. And so in going back to chapter 10 of the Parashat, where we encounter the inverted nunes of redemption, Hashem told Moshe that he was to produce 2 silver trumpets, and that upon that when blown upon, the Shekhinah would get ready to travel, and therefore he was to blow these trumpets, and that the people, when they hear them, they would have to get ready to travel as well. So we read here in Numbers 11, verse 1 through 4, and then also verses 8 through 9. The Torah says over here, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, Aseh lecha shtei chatzot zerot kesef miksha. Make for yourself 2 silver trumpets, make them hammered out, and they shall be yours, summoning the assembly of the camps of the journey. When they sound a long blast, it says summoning the assembly to cause the camps to journey. It says, when they sound, v'taki'u v'chen v'noadu elecha. They sound a long blast with them. Then kol ha'edah, the entire assembly shall assemble you, and therefore el petach ohel moed, at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And it says, v'im ba'achat yitka'u, if they sound a long blast, the leader shall assemble to you the heads of Israel's thousands. And then going on here to verse 8 through 9, continuing with through verse 1 through 4 to 8 through 9, it says, Uvnei Aharon HaKohanim, and then the sons of Aaron, the Kohanim, that Yitkeu Bachatzot Zerot, they shall sound the trumpets, and it shall be V'hayu Lachen Lechukat Olam Ledorotechem, and it shall be an eternal decree for your generations. And then the verse goes on to conclude. It says, when you wage war, V'chi tavo'u milchama be'artzechem, in your land. Look what this is here. El hatzar hatzorei echem, against an enemy who oppresses you, you shall sound short blasts, bachatzot zerut, upon these trumpets, and then vaniz kartem, and you shall be remembered lifnei Hashem, before Hashem Elohechem, your God, and you shall be saved from your enemies. Very interesting when you take a look at these verses over here. First, why is the call of Vayihi Betzah Ha'aron juxtaposed by the blowing of the Shtei Chatzot Zerot, the 2 silver trumpets? For the Torah to prevail in our life, we need to learn the secret of these trumpets. For one, I want to point something out here that's very interesting that you see running through the verses in Hebrew, but it's not picked up in the English. The 3-letter root of the word Chatzot Zerot is the word Chatzer. The verb Chatzer refers to literally a courtyard. Now, when applied to musical instruments such as the silver trumpets, Chatzer means to produce a sound as a signal to others, like what the Torah is indicating. Now, the sound of the Chatzot Zerot is to call others to direct their attention to the one who's producing the sound. And so the one who blows the Chatzot Zerot becomes the center, he forms a circle around him. Somewhat like a court, Chatzot Zerah. And so the Chatzot Zerah is the instrument for forming a court. It summons others to come to the courtyard. The Torah says that the sounds that are to emanate from the Chatzot Zerot are a tekiah and a truah, which most people are familiar with when we sound the shofar. Now, the word tekiah, it actually comes from the word teka, which refers to thrusting or forcefully inserting an object into a wall or a ground. In the sphere of music, teka denotes the forceful and prolonged blowing of a column of air into a wind instrument. Tekiah denotes the strong, sustained tone produced by the blowing. So many of us are familiar with the actual Seder Shofar service during Rosh Hashanah, with the SOS code, Morse code that we sound off with the Tekiah, Shofar, Teruah sound. The word Teruah it means to break. In relation to music, teruah denotes the broken, trembling tone composed of several short blasts. The Torah says that the camps of Israel moved in a certain direction if the sound was a tekiah or a teruah sound. And when the Torah refers to the Kohanim blowing the chatzotzerot, it indicates that since the Kohanim were the servants of the Torah in the sanctuary, the deliverance of Israel will depend on how they respond to the Torah. And just as the teruah that basically calls for the decampment of the demands of the people to move with vigor, the teruah also directed to God in time of distress is nothing but a cry for salvation. And so the Torah says that when the chatzotzerot are sounded, we read here in Numbers 10 verse 9, it mentions V'chi tavo'u milchama be'artzachem, when you wage war in your land against, this is an enemy. But I can tell you right now, the word enemy is not even in the Hebrew. It says al hasar hatzored. It mentions upon a distress, a conflict. Okay, when you do this, then Hashem is going to vanir's kartem, remember you. Interesting, because by referring to the word zachar, it indicates that something that was lost, that even though it was lost, it was never forgotten. And so what we learn is that the tekiah, the calling of God, the Shekhinah, is to focus God's presence upon us. And so for the Torah to prevail in our lives, we need to learn to truly call out to Hashem. How? In prayer. Now earlier when I showed some of the footage there in Israel with the missiles from Iran hitting Tel Aviv, if you listen close, one of the words that you'll hear the people saying, tefillot, 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 prayer, 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 pray, 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 pray. It's sad that we have to wait until we see ballistic missiles hitting our cities and our neighborhoods to pray. It's sad that we have to wait for this, and it happens right when Shabbat is being ushered in. A set of sitting, rejoicing, right? But this is exactly when the Torah says, when this happens, you begin to cry out. And so, the chatzotzerot really represent prayer. When we stand in the courtyard of life crying out to Hashem to save her from the forces of the Yetzer Hara, He will respond to our prayer by scattering the forces of evil that prevent us from spiritually maturing. That's what Moshe said. Now it's worth pointing out here that the word chatzer from chatzotzerot, back over here, okay, is from the two-letter root sar, which means narrow. And I have it, do I have it? Yes, I have it highlighted right here. That when you enter and wage war, be'artzechem al hatzar, doesn't say enemy there, but you go to war against a distress, okay? The two-letter root sar there, hasar, the definite article. Sar means narrow. The Torah says that when this happens, we are the sound of chatzotzerot, when we wage war against an enemy that tries to restrict us in be'artzechem, our land. In our land. Now the reference here, be'artzechem, in your land, is a reference to the inner parts of your being where the Yetzer Hara begins to al hatzar hatzored echem, to try to constrict you. Because by constricting us spiritually, getting us to doubt, not have faith in Hashem, right? Be depressed, be worrisome, the Yetzer Hara creates a drive within us. And this is what happened to the Israelites then. We need to go back to Mitzrayim, where we could play it safe. What's Mitzrayim? As explained earlier, take a look at this. Mitzrayim is not limited to a location in Egypt. Mitzrayim, the root is the word mitzar, which means a constriction. And the two-letter root of mitzar is sar, just like what the Torah is saying here. When you come, v'chi tavo'u milchama be'artzechem al hatzar, you're waging war against the Yetzer Hara. In Mitzrayim, I explained before, if you look at the top of the two mems, It begins with a regular mem and concludes with a mem sofif. That mem has a narrow opening. You can get in, but you can't always get out. It's a consciousness people will lock themselves into and they can't break free from. Mitzrayim represents a lifestyle of spiritual death. That's what it represents. And so this is why you can have certain physical conflicts in the world, okay, with anti-Semitic enemies, but if you can't defeat the real enemy within, those enemies will never go away. If the Chatzot Zerot represent prayer, and to have the Torah prevail in our life, we need to be committed to calling out to Hashem in prayer. What happens if a person's struggling in prayer? In other words, let's say you've been calling out to Hashem, but Yetzer Hara is always rearing its ugly head. What do? Juxtaposed to sounding the Chatzot Zerot, when it comes to war, the Torah says that we are to also sound the Chatzot Zerot out on our days of joy. We go right into Numbers 10:10. And it says, Uvayom simchatchem uvmoadechem uvroshechem chodeshechem, on your days of joy, and your festivals, and your new moons. You shall what? Ut katem bachotzetero el oletechem. You shall sound the trumpets over your elevation offerings, over your festivals, zivchei shalamechem, peace offerings. V'hayulachem lezicharu lifnei Elohechem, to be remembrance for your God. Why? Ani Hashem Elohechem, for I am Hashem, your God. In Masechah Sukkah, I don't have the passage, but you can look it up in Sukkah 53b. Chazal explained that the Chatzot Zerot were to be blown daily at the morning and afternoon tamid, and also at any musaf, any additional offerings such as Shabbat, Yom Tov, like Pesach, Sukkot, etc. So what happens if a festival interacts with a holy day? For example, what happens if Rosh Chodesh falls on Shabbat, or Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat? In the case of Rosh Hashanah falling on Shabbat, that would constitute what's considered 3 musafim. Since Rosh Hashanah is a special musaf, additional offering, okay, the first of Tishrei is a musaf, and Shabbat is a musaf. If the Chatzot Zerot were to be blown for the korbanot and holidays, how does one blow the Chatzot Zerot in relation to a day that has 3 musafim? So Chazal responded to this question in Masechah Sukkah 54a, and he said that only one series of tekiyot was to be blown for all musafim together. So if that's the case, why did the Torah specifically stipulate, as we'll bring it back here, when it says, you shall uv moadechem uv roshei chodshechem, on your appointed days and also new moons? By mentioning appointed days, holidays, moadim, and also new moons, it would seem to indicate each holiday, even if they fall on the same day, should have their own tekiyot blown separately. On top of that, why did the Torah have to preface the holidays at the beginning of the verse here? I'll bring it up on the screen. Not sure what happened there, but anyway, it says, Uvayom, Yom Simchatchem, on your days of joy. Is Shabbat not a simcha, not a joyous day? Is Sukkot not a simcha? I mean, Sukkot is called Zman Simchenu, the days of our rejoicing, the time of our rejoicing. So what the Torah wants you and I to understand is that when it speaks about having simcha on the days mentioned in this verse, it's not speaking about a mood of elation that is brought about by a special occasion, like, oh, tomorrow's my birthday, right? Let me get joyful. Or tomorrow is a holiday. I don't have to go to work, so let me find some reason to enjoy. No. Rather, the simcha that the Torah is referring to is a state of mind, a state of consciousness. When it comes to experiencing redemption, Chazal use an interesting expression. I don't have it on the screen, but they say, Ein tzibor meit ve'ein tzibor oni. The nation of Israel knows neither death nor poverty. What is this supposed to mean? It means that constant joy must prevail in God's house and sanctuary of His Torah. In the sanctuary of God's Torah, death and mourning, meaning spiritual difficulties and woes, okay, that come from the Yetzer Hara that try to get us away from Hashem, must be left behind. In the shadow of God's presence, we serve Hashem, simcha shel mitzvah. through the joy of the commandments. And so the expression Yom Simchatchem means that every day, as David HaMelech says in Psalm 100, Ivdu et Adonai b'simcha, we are to serve, worship Hashem in joy. And so the Torah is telling us that the key to experience redemption is that our days must be days of joy. And when we have the opportunity to appear before Hashem in daily prayer, symbolic of the Korban Tamid, Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, Sukkot, etc., that in each of these days we are to give expression through Korban, okay? Sacrifice, which is Karav, which is drawing near to God. Even in the absence of an animal, we draw near to the death of the Korban Chai, a living sacrifice. The Korban allows us to experience self-renewal. And on these occasions, we call out to Hashem with the Chatzotzerot, with the voice of prayer. So let us understand the reason why the Torah returns to the narrative of redemption with the mitzvah of Pesach is because Pesach, once again, renews the consciousness of our spiritual mission. It brings us back to who God chose us to be to represent Him. And this is why, as we live in these days, and these events unfold us, and people could speculate, and they can guess, and they could try to decode prophecy and everything, and everyone's going to do what they need to do. We have to understand where true Geulah lies at. It's in the Torah. It's not in a person's hashkafa or a military ideology. It doesn't mean that a person or a nation should be defenseless either, don't get me wrong. But it should mean that it has to be with faith in Hashem. So the outcome in this situation, nobody knows. Everybody does anticipate the end game has to be the world against Israel. And if that's the case, then so be it. But Israel also has to recognize that Hashem is in charge. You cannot have faith in other politicians, other allies. You have to have faith in Hashem. Doesn't mean you can't make friendship, have peace, right? These things are important. But the blueprint is through the Torah. If you think that the Torah, Moshe, concepts like Mashiach are fairy tales, and you're a politician that sits in the Knesset, Hashem help you have mercy upon your soul to bring you to the truth of who He is. Because you'll see your allies will turn on you, right? Your enemies will rise up against you. And so we can speculate about redemption, but true redemption is as the Torah tells us. So as tragic as it sees destruction and things taking place, you know, seeing missiles invade Israel's airspace and destroy, and seeing people rejoice over this, it's sad as that is. The Torah tells us that we need to rejoice before Hashem. Ivdu et Adonai b'simcha. We have to be confident in our amunah and betachon. It's greater in our God than the violence of our enemies. That we have to rejoice in Hashem, increase our commitment to Him, and also Gimlu Chasadim and all the other things that the Torah requires of us. And do it for the sake Lishma, for its own sake. And then from that we will see true redemption unfold. The Torah tells us Hashem was trying to take Israel on the path of redemption. But they began to become nostalgic. It was too hard, it was difficult, they didn't want to change. And this is unfortunate. Einstein said when you do the same thing over and over and don't see results, that's insanity. And so we can't expect politicians and other personalities to think that this is going to be the path of Geulah. Nothing changes. And therefore we have to truly return to the Torah. Vayhi b'tzah ha'aron. So when you say those words and the Torah comes out, you have to visualize with kavanah that the Torah of God is going to have victory in your life. Have victory in the life of Israel. Have victory in the entire world. And so with that said, Chavarim, is going to bring me to a close here for my teaching on Parashat Beha'alotkha. Hope that this teaching has been insightful and challenging to you as well. And if our organization has been a blessing to you and you'd like to support us, you can find a link to donate directly below the video's description. We want to thank everybody in advance for their support and their prayers. If you have any questions regarding this teaching, feel free to send me an email. I do answer those in the order that they arrive in. And so until next time, Chavarim, may the God of Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov bless you and your family. Shalom.